What is dog music?
uh, Dog music is whatever I do.
Hey folks, this is Mickey Abraham with Lessons with Marcel, and today we've got a super special guest, mandolin legend, my friend David Grisman. Welcome, David Grisman.
Hey, thanks, Mickey. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Man, we go way back. It's almost 20 years that we've known each other as friends.
Well, I go way, way, way back.
Would you welcome, please? Please. Would you welcome, please? The David Grisman Quintet.
Playing tonight will be Chet Atkins, Jerry Douglas, Mark O'Connor, Taylor Fleck, Dave Grisman, Tony Rice. Is that everybody?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Grisman.
I just wanted to remind you and me of how we first met nearly 20 years ago. I called up Craig Miller. That's the acoustic disc producer who does all the music and all the producing.
Well, he doesn't do any of the producing. He does the executive producing. He gets the contract signed.
He's good at that too. 20 years ago, I was a young kid then. There was no gray on my beard, and I said, Craig, me and some friends are putting on a Larry Rice benefit concert. Larry was very sick. Can you send some free CDs? And I thought he would send tone poems. Tony Rice was going to be there. We knew Tony. We'll have Tony sign the CDs and we'll raffle them off. That was my idea as a young kid. 5 minutes later, Craig calls me back and he's like, well, of course we're going to send you all the Tone Poems albums that you want. That's a no-brainer. But David obviously wants to go to Florida and play. It never even dawned on me that you would come to Florida. I was the one who picked you up from the airport with Lee, and that's how we became friends, and you've done a lot of things for me and my family and my students. Thank you for being the great musician that you are, man.
Well, I appreciate that, Mickey, and brings back a lot of good memories. Being in Florida, I arranged a recording session with Tony for the project Tone Poets, which was kind of like a corollary to the Tone Poems series. And that was the last session for that project. And sadly, it was the last time Tony and I would record in a studio together. Also, Vassar Clements was at that gig, and that was the last time I ever played with Vassar. So it's, kind of a bittersweet memory. I remember having a great time playing with those guys, and especially Larry.
You did a set with Tony that was kind of a tone poem inspired, and it wasn't even planned for the night. Wow. I think I might have even said, like, hey, you and Tony should play some tone poems as duets, because I don't think that was even planned to happen. Wow. And it was that kind of weekend where it was like anything would go, like, hey, we haven't practiced this, we'll just play duets with Tony, we'll jam with Vassar, we'll just do whatever we need to. Some of the best, most legendary albums that you've produced, they are more than collector's items. This is a time gone by because you produced not only the albums, but the literature that came with them. Can you talk a little bit about how you came up with those concepts to do the albums with the books?
I started producing records in 1963 with Red Allen and Frank Wakefield for Folkways. If you're going to be a professional mandolin player in the early 60s, you better have a couple of backup gigs. So I got into making records, and I always liked the idea of concept records. Since I was really interested in what's become known as vintage instruments, I thought it would be cool to kind of document what some of these obscure instruments sounded like. So I thought of doing duets with Tony on what ended up being 17 pairs of instruments. As opposed to just doing a duo record with Tony and myself, this had another aspect. And of course, it lent itself to a booklet. I thought, well, if I have the instruments panned left and right, the booklet on the left side of the page, would be the guitar, and on the right side would be the mandolin. I had done a project with Andy Statman for Rounder years before that called Mandolin Abstractions. After I moved from New York City, whenever I'd come back, Andy and I would get together and we'd be like in the subway, late at night, waiting for a train, and we'd just take out our mandolins and just start playing. I thought we need to record this stuff. So a few years after that, I got Rounder to agree to let us make this kind of album. And Andy flew out to California, and I set up a recording studio. We wouldn't play a note until we got in front of those microphones. And the very first thing we play would be the first thing that would get recorded. And I think we recorded about 27 pieces that were spontaneously either improvised or composed on the spot. And the first thing on that record was the first thing we played, and the last thing was the last thing we played. And then quite a few years after that, we were talking about doing another record, and we arrived at the idea of paying homage to traditional Jewish melodies, and we called it Songs of Our Fathers. Of course, dedicated it to our mothers. Yeah, it was quite an experience, and that also deserved a booklet.
It's a really special era of acoustic disc where I think you were producing some of the best bluegrass folk albums, unreplicable, and, just completely just classics. If you go to someone's house and they're into folk music, you can see it on the wall. Oh, they have a copy of Tone Poems. Even people don't even collect CDs anymore. These are things that people want to show that they've collected.
Well, a few years ago, my wife Tracy and I bought out our partners who wanted to retire in acoustic disc. We didn't know what we'd be up against, but the first thing we decided was to stop manufacturing CDs because people weren't buying them. All of the CDs in the catalog, some 90 CDs, are available digitally, and many of them have been expanded because the download could be any length, really. And I had all the booklets scanned and resized to be able to print out. I realize some people like the physical, whether it's an LP or a CD, but we have to try to stay in business. All of the releases, or many of them in all three formats, all at the same price of $10.
Are you putting out music from your archives that no one's ever heard before, old music, or are you putting out new recordings that are recorded recently in the past few months?
All of that. I'm mining my archives, which are very extensive. I haven't even listened to half of it because,
right.
For years, I recorded shows on various formats. I mentioned to you and Marcel in a warm-up conversation, my son Sam just drove up a last batch of tapes that I had in a studio, and one was marked New Smoky Grass Boys. That was the only mark on it. And I had a band in Berkeley, California called the Smoky Grass Boys. So I thought it was that. So I gave it to my engineer to transfer. And he came back and said, that sounds really good. I listened to it, and it's Tony Rice, me, probably Daryl and Todd, and a still unidentified banjo player. It was 14 instrumentals. And I don't even remember recording it, but it's really great.
Really?
And actually, I've never heard Tony Rice play with more abandon than on this tape. He's just mashing it on the rhythm.
That's remarkable.
And in many of these projects, I've added material, like the Tone Poems. We did the complete Tone Poems.
Very interesting, and it has the conversations too. What David's talking about, I've heard this, and if you're a Tone Poems fan and you know the way that songs go, you get to hear the alternate takes. You get to hear you and Tony working out the intros, working out the outros. Tony asks questions like, is that the ending? And you're like, well, it might be. Things like that. I think it's a super cool insight for the listener because we wonder about those things. Well, how did Dawg and Tony come up with the outro to the song? How did they come up with that little fill? And it's super cool to hear how the songs came about.
If you like a record or an artist and you're kind of fanatical like I am, and probably you are, Marcel probably too, you just want to hear it all. The pizza tapes really was the start of that kind of thing.
Can you unravel the mystery? That's one of my questions, and you just went there yourself. There's so many little versions of that story. What is the real story behind the pizza tapes, dude?
The real story is, while we were making Tone Poems, I invited Jerry over to meet Tony Rice.
Stop that. Stop that right now. Don't be doing that.
Yeah, it's a trip seeing you guys together, man.
Should have happened a long time ago.
This is gonna be a hoot.
Yeah.
You all ready?
Yeah.
he came over and we had all these instruments lying around, and we immediately switched gears and, hey, you want to pick a few? We set up a mic for Jerry, and that happened 2 nights in a row. We just played whatever popped into our minds, and we would do multiple takes. I didn't have any project in mind. I just thought, hey, this is worth the price of the tape and the engineer, and, we just went for it and recorded all this stuff. Never did anything with it, and then a couple of years after that, I believe WBAI, which is a real big FM station in New York City, got a hold of what must have been a cassette, a 90-minute cassette. And they played this on the radio. And I guess a bunch of people taped it because at gigs, people would come up to me with these tapes or ultimately CDs of this stuff. And I would just get pissed off because it's one thing for live performances to get circulated. I mean, you're out there and people can record it, but this was something from my studio.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I don't know how this got out. We interrogated the engineer and everything. We tortured people. We couldn't find out, Mickey.
Where was the legend born from that the pizza delivery guy stole the tape?
Yeah, that's a story. I don't know where I heard that. Another story is that Jerry gave a copy of this to his scuba diving instructor in Hawaii.
Hi, I'm Jerry Garcia. You probably know me as a guitar player. We're going to go for an introductory dive off the Kona coast of the big island of Hawaii.
But I always liked the pizza connection, and it lent itself, in my mind, to some creative packaging where we duplicated the pizza delivery box, and then the CD itself, it's being round, was made into a pizza. This thing was circulating as a bootleg. In fact, I heard the Grateful Dead confiscated like 6,000 copies of this. So I had a young man named Rob Bleedstein worked for us for a while. And one day he showed up with a bootleg CD, and it sounded really bad. I mean, because it's probably made from copies of a cassette. And I had these beautiful sounding recordings. So I decided, I should put this out. And I wrestled with the fact that most of the bootlegs were about 90 minutes long. Do I put it all out, or do I make one good CD? So I decided to make one good CD. I realized that a lot of the things that were reasons I wouldn't have released it was exactly what people loved about it.
It's so important for us to remember that, because it's like we never want to put anything that we consider a mistake. Those mistakes are only mistakes to you. The listener hears something so different. Some of my favorite records of all time have like these like pops and scrapes, and it's you know what I'm saying, and you've experienced it yourself. Another album that comes to mind is Dawg. That's like, it's literally just you guys sitting and picking. It's the opposite of arrangements. Doc Watson is like, I forgot to give David a break. And that's the track that's on the album.
I forgot to give David a break.
Oh, hey. That's okay.
I'd like to ask specific questions about some of your tunes. Like, for example, your version of Minor Swing. When I'm at jam sessions, and someone calls the tune Minor Swing, it's kind of like a jam buster, because half the people are expecting the original A minor Django version, which is played at bluegrass and folk jams. Some people are expecting your version, the D minor bluegrass, which of course has the bridge. The original one didn't have the bridge. Totally different groove, different key, different chords. Because the tunes are sister tunes, and you obviously used Minor Swing to compose your Minor Swing, they might not even notice that they're two different songs. And they don't understand that it's almost like the end of Django's version is like the beginning of yours.
Right. Well, you may find this hard to believe, Mickey, but that was just, it wasn't a thought out thing. That's just kind of the way I remembered it. It was just a totally, pretty unconscious thing.
That is I couldn't even have imagined a better answer than that.
Well, it's true. I mean, I just started playing it that way. And it's funny, when we got to record that and a few other songs with Stefan, he never said a word about it,
He never even questioned that it had a new part.
He didn't say, that's not the way it goes, kid.
That's the question. Like, what was it? Because Stefan helped kind of compose. I don't know if he composed the tune, but he's kind of there as Django composed. They composed it together, or he was there as it was being composed. So
he told me that they were in a band, I think it was called Hatchets. orchestra. They played in big hotel ballrooms. And he said during the breaks, they would just fool around backstage. And I think a lot of these tunes are just, they came up with them pretty quick. They were just little vehicles for them to jam on.
Does Dawg himself have a favorite Dawg tune? It might change over the years.
No, I don't. That's like asking somebody if he has favorite children or, you know. I'm kind of like whatever tune I'm writing now. I try to do the best I can. I mostly try not to repeat myself. I don't want to keep writing the same tune.
While you do never repeat yourself, it's not the same song ever. It's always this new song. But by having some of the things that you might throw into not only your own tunes, but some of the same licks you might play in fiddle tunes also,
right,
it makes your playing instantly recognizable.
Right. Well, having said all that I just said, you know, it's really hard to avoid being yourself. There's similarities between a lot of it.
Yeah, I think that's what distinguishes someone like you and Tony from what I would call a studio musician. Tony can't be a chameleon, you know. David Grisman can't, you can't just be like, well, I don't know who that is. He's just playing any style. You know Dawg in one note.
I have my own theories about all of this. Like styles, to me, is something you can't write down, like bluegrass. The way I learned bluegrass was like working with really great bluegrass musicians, like Red Allen.
How do you come up with your version of a tune like Soldier's Joy?
Well, I start by trying to learn, note for note, somebody's version that I like. Mm-hmm. Years ago, I worked out Bill Monroe's version of Katie Hill. And I never recorded it. It's on that tape that I just talked about with Tony. And it's blazing. I mean, I can't play that way anymore at all.
And you would actually do that. You would learn a fiddle tune, someone's version that you already respected and knew it was a good source.
So I learned Katie Hill. And Artie Rose wanted to learn that, and I tried to show it to him orally, A-U-R-A-L, and he just couldn't get it. So believe it or not, I had the idea, if I put 4 lines on a piece of paper and wrote numbers on them, and I didn't know what tablature was, that it existed. I said maybe he could get it that way. I kind of, in my own way, invented tablature for Artie Rose, so he could learn Katie Hill.
That's crazy, man. When you then memorize a version of the tune, and then you're going to jam on it, like say a tune like Soldier's Joy, which is so traditional and no one plays the same way, they always end up kind of sounding like the Dawg. You know, there's no mistaking that it's your version, and you throw your licks in there. Is that something that is consciously done, that how you can create your own licks into this melody?
It evolves, you know.
Exactly,
when
right.
I listen back, for example, to this tape that was probably made 40 years ago, maybe in the 70s. You know, I play it totally different.
Exactly. It's amazing how that works. So could you demonstrate what you would think would be the most basic melody of Soldier's Joy the way it exists to you today, right now?
Well, I'm not warmed up and I'm an old man, but...
You know how you go like this? Most, say, like, Mel Bay books would do something like this. With more of, like, the leading tone, the major scale. And which is obviously a line that people would play in there. By you doing the 6th instead of the 7th, it sounds to me more like an old-time fiddle. And a little bit more... Yeah, I remember hearing Doc and Dawg and being like, wow, that's so interesting how David goes like this, and then from the B to the D. And I was like, oh, you can just take major scales and make them pentatonics, and it kind of sounds more old-time fiddly.
Well, it's just the way it came out, you know.
Totally.
A lot of it is based on what feels good to my hands ultimately, because when I used to transcribe stuff note for note, and invariably there'd be some stuff in there that was hard for me to play, so I might amend it to make it more playable.
Another interesting thing I'd like to ask you about is your version of Tico Tico, one of my favorite songs of all time. I remember hearing that tune. My cousin played it on the banjo, my cousin Ron Deckelbaum. And I thought, man, that song's amazing. It had 3 parts, and each part got progressively cooler. What a cool tune. And it has a pretty specific melody. If you listen to people, the South American guys play it, they have a pretty, almost like notated version. It's almost something that's been composed and written out.
Yeah, it has been. I think the guy named Abro wrote that. I never got the music to it, and
That's what I was going to say, is your version is unique. And it's something that is so interesting to me, how you take tunes like that people do solo over, and they do obviously improvise over, But you made the melody your own.
I think it starts with imitation. I started out trying to copy my heroes. I got really immersed in Bill Monroe and just was trying to learn every solo and every tune exactly the way Bill played it and noticed. And it got to the point where if I was playing a tune that Bill Monroe never played, how would Bill Monroe play this tune? At some point, I said, why am I doing this? Bill Monroe's already out there doing it. I also started writing tunes because my heroes wrote tunes. And I noticed, well, Bill Monroe writes these original tunes. Frank Wakefield writes these original tunes. Jesse McReynolds, Bobby, all my heroes, wrote original mandolin tunes. I said, I need to do that. So I consciously wrote my first tune. And then after that, they just kept occurring to me. And then I realized people like this stuff. I might as well do it my way because there's no real future in just being a carbon copy of somebody else if you're going to be a professional musician.
What is Dawg music?
Dawg music is whatever I do. I guess, Jerry gave me that nickname, Dawg. And when I first had accumulated tunes and Tony Rice, came out to California to play my music, he was interested in those tunes, especially ones that were more into jazz, because that's what he was playing with J.D. Crowe and the New South in the Sheraton Inn, but he was listening to Oscar Peterson and John Coltrane during the day. I guess he heard something in my music that was something he wanted to do that he hadn't quite figured out where to do it, where he could do that. It was kind of an idea whose time had come, for a lot of people. And when I first started out with my band, I knew it wasn't bluegrass. So I was trying to separate myself from bluegrass, mostly so that people wouldn't come expecting that, and then be disappointed. Early on, I wouldn't let promoters use the word bluegrass in advertising. And I figured if I had people kept saying, what do you call this? And so I had this nickname, Dawg. And I said, I'll just call it Dawg music. I have a tremendous, wait a minute, I have to, got it. Oh, whoops. Oh my God. Hang on a second. I got to get rid of my phone.
David, I wanted to ask you about the production of the EMD movie, the Eat My Dust movie.
They steal a super stalker and tell the world to eat my dust. Darlene is in the fast cars. Hoover is in the Darlene.
In case people haven't seen it, because it's a little obscure, but you recorded a bunch of music for the soundtrack.
Right.
How did that happen? How did that deal come to be?
It started with a movie called Big Bad Mama.
Hold it right there, mister.
Angie Dickinson is Big Bad Mama.
This friend of mine, Greg Prestopino, was offered this gig, and he knew that it should be like a bluegrass. It was like a female Bonnie and Clyde, He knew he didn't have enough money to just kind of hire me to partner with him, so he more or less turned me on to this gig of writing this score for this movie, Big Bad Mama. And I guess they liked it, and they hired me for a second one, which is Capone. Which was Ben Gazzara with something stuffed in his mouth to make him look like Al Capone. And then the third one was Eat My Dust. They were very low budget, but he let you do whatever you wanted, and he gave you all the publishing rights. So I said, I'm going to write one song and just use it everywhere in this movie. Well, I used a lot of stuff, as it turned out, but that was recorded in my living room and with Tony Rice and Darrell Anger. In fact, some of the pieces and the soundtrack tapes I had never recorded except in that movie and some in the other movies too. And part of some of those are in this Dawg Work series of, I found a track where I'm playing guitar. Tony and I are both playing guitar.
That's wild. That's such a wonderful story. I love that. Well, it's such a unique piece of history. A lot of people know the tune but haven't seen the film. I think it's just so interesting to go back and watch the movie.
Well, that film is actually how Ron Howard got his start as being a director, because Roger said, if you make this film about, teenage hot rod racers, I'll let you direct a movie. And that's how he got to be a movie director initially.
Now we just need to get all of the Lessons with Marcel instructors together to play Ricochet.
All right.
David, this was even more enlightening than I thought. This covered more interesting topics than I would have even thought we had time for. This was amazing. Would you consider coming back and doing it again sometime?
Sure.
Awesome. We thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I keep up the good work, you and Marcel, and I've enjoyed watching many episodes that you have posted. We got to keep acoustic music alive.
We sure do. Thank you so much, David.